Okay, I'm going to get us kicked off. I see some folks are already asking some questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer those as we go. One of the questions that was asked right away is this a continuation of our presentation from November? So we did do a November presentation on deer populations. In particular, we had a game warden on, Alan Sutton. So we were talking a little bit more about rules and regs, and we decided to do a follow-up, which is tonight. So we will be covering new ground tonight that we did not cover in November. So somebody had already asked that question. So Jody and Brian are going to cover some new stuff tonight. So anyway, just to kick us off, thanks for being here. Happy New Year, 2026. This is our first backyard forestry webinar of 2026. Thank you for being here. NJFA extends our best wishes for the new year, and we appreciate all your support. And we encourage you if you're not a member, to please join. We would love to have you as part of our organization here. Okay, so tonight again, this is kind of all things deer in New Jersey. It's going to be a sequel to New Jersey's deer population explosion, as we called it last time. We have Jody and Brian back. They were with us in the Q&A at the tail end of the presentation back in November. Just a couple things I need to read here. So NJFA is a 501c3 organization which advocates for all forests in New Jersey by supporting responsible, sustainable use and science-based forest management. We are the voice of woodland owners in New Jersey, both public and private. This presentation is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to constitute specific legal, tax, or other advice. No claims, promises, or guarantees are made about its accuracy, completeness, adequacy, or suitability. We encourage landowners to consult with their own attorneys, accountants, and foresters for professional advice concerning their woodlands and otherwise. Just a real quick, so if anybody's looking for Rich Kelsky. He's not here tonight. He really handles most of our legislative stuff and really does a great job keeping up with it. So this is a slide he put together for me just to read really quickly. So bills affecting woodlands and agriculture lands have been advancing in January during the lame duck session of the legislature, and several have been passed. These include three which have been or will be signed by the governor. The first, which amends the Farmland Assessment Act. The second, which restricts invasive species. And the third, which permits the acquisition of easements on privately owned woodlands. We're going to cover these topics in our annual meeting. So March 21st, mark your calendar, March 21st, 2026. As most of you know, we do have an annual meeting that we host at Rutgers down in New Brunswick. It's an all-day event where we have presenters come in, and we'll be talking about a whole host of kind of forestry issues, but we will be spending some time talking about legislation and things that are kind of coming down the pipeline, things that affect in particular landowners and forest management. So we hope you'll join us. So mark that date on your calendar, March 21st. Yeah, it's 2 months away basically. So okay, I think we're ready to get moving here. So just a quick little disclaimer for some of you, or maybe tuning in, not 100% sure what we're going to cover, but I just want to say that this is going to be kind of really broad. So Brian and Jody are going to be talking about kind of deer populations, deer management in New Jersey. So this isn't specific necessarily to northern New Jersey or central or southern, though I'm sure they're going to touch on all regions throughout the presentation, but it's not one particular region. The other thing I would say too is, this is not about like the regulations in particular. So it's not going to be about bag limits or zones and changes that somebody might want. It's not going to be super specific about that stuff. So, and lastly, I'd just say it's a complex topic. So we're grateful to have Jody and Brian with us to shed some light on these things. So without further ado, let's introduce them. So Jody Powers is a supervising biologist for New Jersey DEP Fish and Wildlife, serving as the Deer Project leader, as well as supervising the upland game, turkey, and waterfowl and migratory bird projects as the Deer Project leader. Jody oversees all aspects of the Deer Project, including supervising two regional deer biologists and the deer outreach biologist. Jody has a BS in natural resource management with a focus of wildlife management and has been with New Jersey Fish and Wildlife for over 30 years, all of which have been on the Deer Project. Then we have Brian Schum. He's a senior biologist for New Jersey Fish and Wildlife, serving as the Deer Project's Deer Outreach Biologist. As a deer outreach biologist, Brian provides guidance and technical assistance to communities experiencing challenges with overabundant deer. To that end, Brian coordinates the community-based deer management permits and depredation permits for farmers. Brian has a BS in ecology, evolution, and natural resources from Rutgers, where he researched shorebirds in the Delaware Bay and worked with white nose syndrome affected bats. Before arriving at DEP Fish and Wildlife, Brian worked for USDA APHIS Wildlife Services on various pestilent birds and mammals, and then at Plant Protection and Quarantine, largely fighting against spotted lanternfly. Okay, thank you, Jody. Thank you, Brian, for being here. And I am going to stop my screen share here and let you all take over. I don't need to talk anymore. Here we go. Stop share. Okay, all you, Brian. Hey Brian, one more note I meant to mention to folks. So Q&A, we have a list. A lot of you submitted questions. Thank you already when you signed up. So we'll be referencing that list as we go through the presentation. But if something is said and you have a question, by all means drop it in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that throughout the time tonight and see if we can answer some more of your questions. The chat, you're welcome to use it, but I'm going to try to focus more on the Q&A. So if you'll drop your questions in there and make it easier. Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you. So, yeah, I decided to have a little fun with this presentation. Since this is a follow-up, we're going to be going into Deer, New Jersey, their significance, kind of their history, their evolutionary history, and their management. We'll be getting into some population management options towards the end, and a little bit about deer impact mitigation. So jump into it. Why do deer matter? So I think it's important to start this because a lot of this a lot of this presentation is going to be talking about overabundant deer populations and their management. And so a lot of the dialogue around deer right now, especially in the Northeast, is that of a negative. Deer being too many, the negative impacts that they pose. And I think it's just important to step back and reflect that they are this beautiful animal. So I like this quote that deer seem the very soul of the woods. They have this kind of almost mythological nature to them that when you see one, especially see one in a wild place, it captures your attention, and I think that's good. So we have these are a couple examples of some cave paintings. The one on the left, these are of mule deer out in the Grand Canyon. That's about 4,000 years ago. That was dated to. And then on the right, that's 17,000 years old. It's a painting of an Irish elk that's extinct, and that's in France. So their ecological benefits, again, we're trying to start positive. So they obviously are an extremely important prey animal for carnivores and scavengers. If we think of bear, bobcat, coyote that are currently roaming in New Jersey, deer are an integral part of their diets at different parts of the year. For scavengers, things like turkey vultures, black vultures, bald eagles, fonk skunk, possums. These are all animals that rely heavily on the carcasses of deer. And small mammals will chew on their antlers to help control their tooth growth and get a little calcium. So there's a study that came out that under certain circumstances, they can actually increase the growth rate of larger trees that have already exited their browse line. So again, in healthy densities, a little bit of thinning by browse can actually be beneficial. And maybe it's worth noting that out in the West and in places like the Great Plains, where so much of the habitat is regulated by historically it was regulated by bison and other ungulates feeding pretty heavily. They actually can sustain meadow habitats through browsing and create important habitats for unique species. This is another interesting study, came out in 2022. They kind of hypothesized and then observed that deer, because they do well in riparian and wetland areas, that they can transfer nutrients that are usually just flowing downhill. They can invert that nutrient gradient, and by feeding and then uh, laying their waste in the upland habitats that can actually sort of revert that cycle. Again, important to note that these positive benefits they can be easily outweighed by negative impacts if deer become what we would describe as overabundant. So they're a source of sustenance. I thought this was interesting. There might be older examples, but they there's this example where they found cut marks on an Irish elk bones in a cave dating back 180,000 years. So these were Neanderthals, not humans, not Homo sapiens, but you know, humans have been interacting with, feeding on deer for a very, very, very long time. There is extensive evidence of white-tailed deer consumption by Native Americans. This is a painting that was painted in 1596 after European exploration. This was from exploration of Florida. I went on an extremely deep dive thinking I was going to be talking a lot about Native Americans in this presentation because I think it's really interesting. Basically cut almost all of it, but suffice it to say they were Native Americans were eating white-tailed deer as some significant portion of their diet for the 14,000 years or so. I think it's older now that they're dating it maybe to 21,000 years that Native Americans have been in North America. They've been eating white-tailed deer the entire time. And 70,000 New Jersey deer hunters in 2024 averaged about 29 days a field hunting deer. So that's, a tremendous for people that do deer hunt, it's a tremendous portion of their recreational time during the year. So the picture kind of speaks for itself. For wildlife viewing, I think for white-tailed deer, for most people, it's opportunistic viewing while they're on a hike, but they get a lot of value out of it. But the federal government did estimate that wildlife viewing in general, I think largely fueled by birding, but also on trips to like Yellowstone National Park, things like that, wildlife viewing, you could attribute about 250, I believe that is $1 billion. Count my zeros. So, getting into some of the negatives, deer are ecosystem engineers, particularly when they're overabundant. So, I think I'm kind of speaking to the choir with this audience. I'm going to try to get through it pretty quick. But by exhibiting selective browsing on palatable native species, they can alter the future composition of a forest. So, if we're thinking about, as trees grow up, when they're very vulnerable to deer browse in those sapling and younger states, or by rubbing their antlers on even slightly more mature trees. And they typically put less pressure on invasives. Part of that is just a palatability question, but some of it is that kind of evolutionary familiarity. That being said, I think overwhelmingly it comes down to palatability, and a lot of our native species are just a little bit more palatable to deer than the invasives. And a lot of our invasives, they're titled invasives for a reason. They're very quick growing, so there's other reason why this imbalance can have a really big effect. So this study found that again, somewhat obvious for most of you in the crowd, but it had a strong negative impact, a high deer density on forest understory and herbaceous communities. And interestingly, this study found that herbaceous communities can be semi-permanently affected by deer. So even after deer were excluded from an area, some of these alterations to the soil and to the herbaceous community can be almost permanent in their effects after a long period of deer browsing. And of course, things like soil degradation, a history of disturbance, invasive earthworms in the soil, these all tie into this, but deer exasperate those issues. So this study from 2004 found that deer overabundance significantly reduces invertebrate populations. So that would have a trophic cascade upwards toward affecting things that eat on those invertebrate populations. This New Jersey study found that deer propagate Japanese stiltgrass in their feces, and all the while feeding on native competitors to that very invasive grass. And another study, actually, many studies corroborate this, that high deer densities have a negative correlation with songbird populations. So as deer populations increase, they're browsing down that understory that's wiping out habitat for these very habitat-specific songbird populations. So if we think of our thrushes, some of our warblers that require early successional plants, shrubs, and they take a real hit from deer overabundance. And I thought this is interesting that really bad populations of invasive earthworms have similar effects on herbaceous communities as do high densities of deer. So these things that we have together in New Jersey, they both have a very substantial impact on on these plant communities, and they have sort of an additive effect. So this is a picture from Monmouth County Parks. For those of you that can't see it, this is a deer exclosure, and on one side, outside of the exclosure where deer roam, there is extremely little growth in the understory, and inside the exclosure, it's very dense. I think I will keep it brief at that. So another reason why deer matter, they're a very major tick host. They're an integral tick host. So this quote from this one paper, and I believe this is a New Jersey paper, if I'm not mistaken, that adult black-legged ticks feed predominantly on deer. When deer are eliminated from some habitats by hunting or fencing, the abundance of ticks typically is strongly reduced. And that's because this is just a little image of their life stages. So adult ticks, in order to prepare for breeding, they need to feed on typically a large mammal. Sometimes it is like an avian species, like a goose, but typically it's a large mammal, and often it's deer. And so deer are an extremely important host that can determine tick densities. So high deer densities can lead to high tick densities. So Lyme disease, just to clear up some confusion, and I know this was a question, that Lyme disease is actually transmitted to the ticks by the tick feeding on a mice in an earlier life stage. So mice are the host of Lyme disease until a tick feeds on the mouse. And then in a later life stage, when the tick feeds on a human, that's when it can be transmitted. There's other tick-borne diseases. Don't have a ton of time to talk about them all, nor am I an expert in it. Did I skip something? No, I didn't. Okay. So another reason why deer matter in a negative light. This is probably why I was thinking about it the other day while I was driving. I probably think about deer, even though I'm a deer biologist, probably the better part of when I'm thinking about deer in my life is when I'm driving, just trying to avoid them. It really occupies a large portion of my mind when I'm driving. So deer vehicle collisions have been shown to very closely correlate with deer population abundance, and that makes sense. So we could simplify deer vehicle collision probability by the number of cars driving on the road at a given time and the number of deer, because it's a random collision. One's not trying to get the other. this is happening randomly. So the more cars that are on the road driving at faster speeds, or the more deer. And so deer population, because the number of cars that are on the road remains fairly stagnant, slow growth with time as, we become more populated. But deer populations fluctuate much more than human populations. So we see these trends. So this is um, New Jersey's population estimate in blue, next to the estimated deer vehicle collisions that are statewide. So both statewide estimates. And the trends are actually generally in the same direction. So if you were to kind of look at some simple spots, we see a slight uptick here, and then it goes down. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, actually. Hopefully you can. But around the 2015 area, and then really into 2015 through 2024, very similar trends, though the deer population does seem to be a little bit more sporadic. There's a few reasons for that. I don't want to harp too much on this graph. We're going to talk about our statewide deer population estimate a little bit more later on, but just showing that, we do have this data and they do correlate somewhat. So another usually negative interaction is that, and I tried to be brief on this slide because I think, again, this audience at the New Jersey Forestry Association is very familiar with this topic and these impacts. And it's probably why a lot of you even attended this meeting, is because of the issues you're having. But landscape and agricultural damage. So a 2019 survey, like a social survey, interviewed farmers, and they found that for 27 farmers, their losses to deer totaled about 1.4 million for that year. So pretty significant. I think illustrating it better is that image on the screen now, showing that somebody put up a deer exclosure in the middle of a soybean field, and you can see the production in that little area versus the surrounding area. And we're just going to assume that they did not like pour a bunch of fertilizer in there. I'm going to take it as authentic, but that observation does make sense. I think it's important to notice and recognize now, and we'll be continuing to hit on this theme throughout the presentation, that deer, they do not evenly roam the landscape. If you live in North Jersey, you have a very different interaction with deer than somebody who lives down in the middle of the Pine Barrens, or somebody who lives in a coastal community, et cetera, et cetera. Here, within one community, as you can see on this map, the deer are clustered, generally speaking, away from the most urban areas of the town and densely clustered near the parks in the town or any green spaces in the town. And so when we're talking about deer damage and the impacts that they're having, one person down the block might have an extremely different interaction with deer, where they have a pleasant interaction when they see the deer because they're not the ones with the deer in their backyard each and every day, feeding on their landscape plants, pooping, to the point where people, can't really walk in their backyard. So depending on where you live, you can have extremely different experience with the deer herd, even within a jurisdiction like this. So to transition into the history of deer in New Jersey, I wanted to briefly touch on the evolutionary history because I think it's just somewhat interesting. So this is kind of the latest descendant of all deer species. So it's a Eumeryx. It's about 50 to 30 million years ago. These two species are the first, about 23 to 11 million years ago, are the first deer species to shed their antlers. So an important junction with ungulates, that they are shedding their antlers. I believe these were thought to not shed them annually, but they did shed them. The annual shedding evolved with time. And then this species, Eokiel, I'm going to not try to pronounce that. You can read it on the screen. About 5 million years ago, this is thought to be the deer species that is now extinct. That whole genera is extinct. And this is what crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia into northwestern North America. And so this is the species that Odocoileus, which is white-tailed deer genera, also mule deer and black-tailed deer. Um, that's what they evolved from. So the oldest Odocoileus, or the oldest kind of whitetail fossil, dates back to 4 million years ago. And it's pretty interesting. I find it interesting that some of these 4 million year old, so like some of the very oldest fossils that we have from the genera of white-tailed deer, those fossils are indistinguishable from modern whitetails. So they really haven't changed a tremendous amount, at least from at least in their structure, which makes sense. 4 million years in an evolutionary timescale isn't tremendously long for an ungulate. But I thought this was an extremely interesting article. This was a buck that was harvested. If I'm not remembering it incorrectly, I believe it was Florida, but I could be mistaken. But it's exhibiting some of these ancient phenotypes. So you can see on its mouth, it still has this particular deer has tusks. But also, a decent proportion of deer do have tusks. I've never seen it personally, but it's not the most uncommon thing. Um, but that the facial pattern on its head with the tusks, it's exhibiting these two very distinct, very ancient phenotypes. So it's very interesting that they still hold those genes. Again, kind of a reminder that they really haven't changed all that much. So getting into their population history, that's enough evolution. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I just thought it was interesting to toss in. Let's get into their population history. And I think this is extremely relevant to today's conversations. I think a lot of people, when they're trying to get at what a healthy population is for New Jersey, they're wondering, and I certainly wonder, what was it like before Europeans changed everything so dramatically? Can we look at historical deer populations and get an idea of what natural is, quote unquote? So there's two widely cited pre-contact population estimates. The first, more or less, is less popular these days. See, in 1929, and it was about 21 deer per square mile, and it's pretty much exclusively based on observer accounts. So this next study, Maccabee, one second. Um, it's a little bit more popular, though it has a lot of flaws. We can talk about it more if we'd like, but um, this study based it on archaeological sites of Native American uh, uh, like settlements and observer accounts of minimum Native American diets. So we're talking about early settlers that wrote down something along the lines of like this Native American family harvested 9 white-tailed deer this last year, and they took all of those accounts, however varying regionally, and they said, okay, so if there's this many Native Americans thought to be in North America, and they minimally ate this many because the minimum number that they were reported to eat per year is this many, to sustain that deer population to feed all of those Native Americans, it would take this many. And they basically just said, double it for all the other predators on the landscape. And that's how we came up with this estimate. So there's a lot of issues with it, um, especially taking those estimates and drawing local conclusions with them. But I went for it, and if you apply these numbers to New Jersey, there was an estimated pre-contact about 31,000 at most Native Americans in New Jersey. The math would shake out to about 200,000 deer in the year 1500, which is actually it's not all that different than our population estimate today. So somewhat interesting, though I heavily caution us to put too much credence in that. This is their historic range pre-contact. And then um, again, without going too much into the weeds with it, this graph is basically just showing, you don't really have to look too closely at it, but it's basically just showing that there's thought to be an inverse relationship between um, the U.S. colonial population and white-tailed deer population. Likewise, there was somewhat of an inverse relationship between Native American populations and white-tailed deer populations because we utilized a lot of them. People, for as long as people, have been eating deer. We're major predators of deer. So I think it's somewhat important to reflect. This is a quote from a book that's actually over my shoulder on that side, by Dan Flores. I'll read it. There was not only tragedy, but irony in this incomprehensible loss of human life, referring to when Native Americans had, it's estimated, about 90% die-offs due to plagues, diseases that we brought over. And as Native people died, Americans' wildlife underwent an explosive ecological release, the very phenomenon that produced the Virgin American mythology. So because people first arrived in less of a colonial status, when they first came, they were first explorers and then colonists. The explorers spread the diseases. And so when the colonists came, and we had a lot of these early writings, what the colonists were experiencing was after the Native Americans had died off at about 90%. So the animals that Native Americans consumed would have experienced this ecological release where a major predator has just died off at a rate of about 90%. So, um, there's some complications to all of the stuff that I just mentioned. Some further complications in New Jersey, if we're thinking specifically about New Jersey now. Um, we used to have wolves in New Jersey. We used to have mountain lions in New Jersey. We used to, and now we have coyotes. So, three very, very major predators, two that we've lost from New Jersey, and one that we've gained, interact with the species in really different ways, extremely different ways, each of them. We used to have elk competing with white-tailed deer for habitat. We used to have bison in New Jersey competing for white-tailed deer for habitat. We used to have the stag moose, which this is super interesting. This fossil is from Warren County, New Jersey. It's in the State Museum. I've yet to visit it, but that fossil of an extinct stag moose was dated only 11,000 years ago today. Really not that long. Mastodon fossils found in New Jersey that were, historically roaming New Jersey. And, this picture just broadly, we know that Native Americans burned the landscape heavily for hunting and for forest management. Today we have extremely suppressed wildfires. We also know from early observer accounts that there's recordings of vast meadows in New Jersey, park-like conditions in our forest where the grasses were like belly button high. Just an extremely different landscape. Add in all the invasive species that we have today, an expansion of urbanization. Things are just extremely different, and it complicates comparing those historical estimates to today. Hopefully that's making sense. Some more on the population history. Just some really neat quotes. This is from a work, The First Gardeners by Matt Knobloch. He's a DEP attorney, kind of amateur part-time historian. That paper is phenomenal. He would probably be a good guest for this podcast. This early account, they reported seeing very great quantities of deer. Again, this is an early settler in New Jersey. Elks chiefly in the mountains, and I'll let people read on their own if they'd like. But this other quote from the year 1670 said that New Jersey around the Raritan River, so the Raritan River, like floodplain, adorned with spacious meadow, enough to maintain thousands of cattle, stored with wild beasts as deer and elk, and the country is full of deer, elks, bear, and other creatures. So, again, this is kind of getting to that almost myth of that virgin America, the virgin wildlife that is untouched. These early colonists seeing just a vast array of wildlife. An indication of historically accurate information, but also, with that virgin mythology in the back of our head, perhaps a bit misleading. So if we get into the kind of the colonial era. So market hunting was vastly impactful for most of our ungulate species, most of our deer, bison. Um, Deer in particular, they were killed for their hides. This is a picture of bison skulls, but it should show you the scale that these animals were persecuted at. Um, and then that market hunting was kind of subsided by uh, subsistence hunting. So people just, if they saw a deer, they shot it. That was very valuable food for them and their family, if nothing else, but for the pelt, if they're doing well on crops. So this is an interesting report that our agency created, published in 1937. I'm just pulling a few items that are of historical relevance. So in 1679, um, the New Jersey colonial legislator banned Native Americans from harvesting white-tailed skins, and this was with the intention of protecting whitetails. Obviously, is protecting them from Native Americans who are doing much of the hunting for the white colonists. Um, and so there's a little bit of a class and a race color to this legislation, but this was an early protection for deer. In the 1890s, except for a few deer that were crossed the Delaware from Pennsylvania side of the river, it had gone entirely. So basically, in the late 1800s to early 1900s, essentially no deer in New Jersey at all. From 1904 to 1913, 197 deer were introduced, and laws were passed to have an extremely high doe protection. During those specific years, from 1904 to 1909, all deer were banned from being harvested, including the bucks. 1936, so a year before this was actually published, 2,034 bucks were killed legally, and over 600 deer were killed by train or automobile. So they're making a comeback at this point. But at this point, in the year 1936, the deer were being found almost exclusively in the rugged and inaccessible parts of the state. And what parts of the state are those? They actually published this really beautiful map. I know you cannot see it specifically, but they hand drew icons of these different game species on the map where there was a substantial breeding population of these critters. So I just tossed stars on the map for you guys. This is where they reported white-tailed deer to be in sufficient notable abundance in New Jersey. And so you can enjoy the map a little bit. This is what it looks like. You can see the white-tailed deer towards the bottom of your screen. But you can see things like squirrel, rabbit, some fish species. One of my favorites, the bobwhite quail, on the map as well. So more from this. This is pretty interesting. At the bottom in orange, you can see that some of the chief concentration points for deer they reported were in Warren's Grove, near which place as many as 50 deer have been killed within a range of less than a mile. So I think it's fair to assume that this means less than a square mile. And so we could actually come up with like a very, like notes on a napkin population estimate from this, because we if we assume that all the legal bucks were killed in that area, because that's generally what would happen, that all of the bucks would be killed, nearly all of them, and we assume a 50% sex ratio, because that's what deer are born at, there was about 100 deer per square mile in this area, more than likely, in the year 1937, which is really interesting. This is probably very close to where they reintroduced some deer, so that had a factor with it. Also, these are remote areas where at the time they were pretty far from agriculture, so they were far from hunting, and our landscape still held things like bobwhite quail, wild breeding populations of pheasant, all indicators that even these dense forests had very vibrant understories to sustain those species. Those species can't breed and live. Obviously, the bobwhite quail is extant from New Jersey, and so we can, kind of make these assumptions that just not assumptions. We have good records of it. South Jersey and these areas looked extremely different at this time. So it might not have been so crazy that these areas held such high densities of deer, even in forest conditions. So this is our all of our modern deer density deer population estimates, excuse me, for New Jersey. So these are statewide estimates. This is from what's called an age at harvest population reconstruction model. And basically, the takeaway from this is that our statewide models are inherently inaccurate because they rely on the hunted population of deer. So where there is hunting, we have a decent idea of what the population is. But as you all are aware, New Jersey is a pretty wild mosaic of urban, suburban, lots of areas with hunter access, and just as many places, if not more, where hunters don't have access. And so these are areas that we don't have a good idea of what the deer population is. Just to illustrate that a little bit more, this is a heat map showing where we have the highest harvest per acre on average for these kind of random 5 years that I had this data made this map from. But basically, you can think that the areas in blue, either there is just low deer density because very few hunters are harvesting deer there, or there's very little hunter access. And that means that we have not the best idea or even no idea of what the deer population is there. And so that's where deer drone surveys come in and deer spotlight surveys come in. So this is a graphic from Dr. Jay Kelly from Raritan Valley Community College. He does the most drone surveys in New Jersey of white-tailed deer, and this is his map. It's important to note that these surveys took place over the course of, I think, several years is a decent word, if not many years. And so this is not on the previous graph. I'll just show this again. We've had, especially recently, if you look at between 2019 and 2024, that's a very sporadic change in our deer population estimate. So we had an outbreak of what's called EHD, epizootic hemorrhagic disease, and that tanked our population in some areas. We estimate by, conservatively 60%, perhaps. It has, without getting too much into it, it can have extreme localized impacts. And so this definitely affected our deer population, and we had back-to-back outbreaks. And so this really changed our deer population. And so if we look at this map, that these surveys were conducted over many years, this is not a snapshot in time. So just a little asterisk next to it. But this does show that, Hunterdon County, Warren County, Mercer County, places that we kind of expect have higher deer densities, a mixture of ag, which has been shown in studies to be a really high factor when it comes to the productivity of a deer population. And a little dot in Bergen County. If any of you out there are from Bergen County, you might see me in your neighborhood giving a presentation. So we keep talking about it. I wanted to take a second before we talk about management options, just to reflect that New Jersey is extremely complex. And somebody actually asked a question about this in our chat, what the appropriate deer densities are for different ecological regions. Well, these are our ecological regions. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds. Other than to say that the sandy soils in the south, they're conducive to fewer species, and they're generally less productive, at least these days. Whereas in the Piedmont, the Skylands, they're generally more productive. These are areas where we have much more. Not going to commit too hard to that. These are areas that we do have a good bit more like big crop agriculture. Down in the Pine Barrens, more blueberries, cranberries, other crops. But either way, the northern part of the state tends to be more productive. So, important takeaway: just expect significant spatial and temporal variability to these conversations. That's not a one size fit all. If I'm talking about reducing a deer population, I'm not necessarily talking about your backyard. I'm talking generally. So I think for the sake of time, you guys can view this on your own. This is found on Rutgers website from the Cursa Lab, and this is a land use change map. And it's just basically showing how development has sprawled throughout New Jersey, creating this really different landscape with time. And this one is just the forestation map of New Jersey. I think we'll skip it. We kind of have an idea of the history of this. And again, just a little, I think worth mentioning that localized issues versus population level issues. Localized issues, there's sporadic damage and they can be solved with deterrence or fencing. Population scale issues, there's ecological damage that often leads to deer health declines, dense tick populations, and I think an important way to identify a population level issue with deer is that fencing and deterrence shift the issues and they don't resolve them. So that's why in my presentations I talk about social carrying capacity versus the ecological carrying capacity. The ecological carrying capacity being just the number of deer that a habitat can support. So when talking about managing deer populations, these are essentially what we have to work with. So if we think of the deer population as the amount of water in a bucket, if you pour more water in, that's our birth rate and our immigration rate. And for the water line in the bucket to decline, we would need to see increased deaths or we need to see increased emigration. If it's at balance, then our birth rate and immigration rate is equal to our death rate and emigration rate. So for the sake of time, I'm going to fly through this. These slides are really more geared towards making recommendations to municipalities. I'm going to jump to the end of this section just to not bore people with this. And I'm going to breeze over why why New Jersey Fish and Wildlife and biologists really across the country always land on lethal management. So if we can control immigration, birth rate, emigration, and death rate, the easiest thing to manage is the death rate. So lethal management has general support from the public. They just want to know that the animals are treated humanely, and that the meat is going to a good place. It's sustainable, and it's inexpensive. If you compare that to really the most logical counterpart, which is birth control, it's perceived as humane, and you have very high control, meaning you can throw money at it and you get results. But birth control requires capture. And so already you run into a logical fallacy where if you have your hands on that animal to begin with, it's more efficient to euthanize it because then you're not releasing an animal back onto the landscape. Birth control also requires very long time scales. Immigration is generally a faster rate of immigration back into that population than the death rate of those animals that are still within the population. And so that's that implied lethality is that you're controlling the birth rate within the population, but the immigration rate is so high that it basically requires you're waiting for these deer to die that are inside, and you're hoping that the immigration rate is slower than that death rate. So it does have an implied lethality. And a lot of these birth control methods, because of deer looking for viable partners to breed with during the rut, that's when they're running around all crazy, crossing the roads without looking both ways. And so with that increased mate searching behavior, because they're not finding those mates that are willing to breed, we often see increased deer vehicle collisions. So it's inefficient and costly. Trapping and relocating, just simply, there's nowhere that nobody wants more deer, not at the scale that we would need to do this, and that's insanely expensive. It's also not humane. Trapping a deer are very stressed animals, and they have very high death rates from stress due to capture. And animal predators, I think it's just simple and obvious to most people that we can't sustain populations of wolves or mountain lions any longer in New Jersey. We've changed the landscape too much. We as people would not tolerate them. Obviously, that complicates the wildlife conflicts. So again, I'm going to breeze through this. So I just wanted to point out a couple things. If we were to again, when we identified what a population level impact of deer is, a population scale issue with deer is versus that localized issue, if it is a population level issue, this is having to do with deer vehicle collisions. But these were all from a study that they looked at ways to reduce deer vehicle collisions. And let's just say that you did all this. They found that fencing, just literally a barrier from keeping deer to cross the road, was really the most effective. Um, culverts or overpasses are probably somewhat similarly effective if they also include barriers to force them to those. But regardless, let's say in an overabundant deer population that you significantly reduced deer vehicle collisions, well, that's a significant portion of your death rate. And so if the death rate significantly declines, you would actually expect to see an increase in the deer population in that area because you've just reduced a significant portion of their death rate. And in a later slide, we'll see human hunting compared to deer vehicle collisions, those rates in a community. So again, similar sort of takeaway, though this is, I think a little bit more geared towards this audience. So these are some things that are consistently recommended, and I think that these are good things for small landowners, people with backyard gardens, things of that nature to consider. Exclosures and repellents, you should consider them. That being said, consider, let's say, fencing with 100% efficacy at scale in a community. You by excluding deer from portions of their range, and we're talking with this theoretical scenario, significant portions of their range, you're actually effectively increasing the deer density in those areas that the deer still have access to. So you're funneling the areas where those deer are pooping, feeding, to a smaller area. So as a statewide biologist making recommendations to like a town, we can't recommend that everyone put up a fence. One, that would look like some third world country that has a high crime rate. But it would also really negatively impact the deer themselves and those areas that can't put up a fence. So hopefully that makes sense. So real quick, we already, I think in the last presentation talked about this sufficiently, but there's a lot of regulations surrounding deer in our hunting digest I have here. It's about deer alone is about 14 pages or so of our digest. And there's a lot of auxiliary general hunting regulations that apply. So if you're interested in hunting and you're not sure, or having a hunter on your property and you're not sure about the regulations, you're confused, first things first, grab a digest. And if you're still confused, our email is going to be in the last slide of this presentation. These are our deer management zones on the right. Again, don't have to get too much in the weeds, but we have more liberal seasons in areas with more deer generally, and generally less liberal bag limits and season dates in areas where we have either more hunters or fewer deer, more hunter access. So I think this is a good one to plug. This is currently not heavily used in New Jersey, but I have a vision for it. And I think this is the audience to pitch it to. So about 78% of the land in New Jersey is privately owned. And so it would logically make sense that about 80% of the deer harvest would occur on private land because that's just equal land mass. We're not at that. It's much closer to 50-50. And so there's just logically, there's a lot of private property, and I think we know this. There's a lot of private property where you can't, where there's no deer management occurring on. So for any like moderately sized, I'm talking like maybe as small as like 5 acres and up, and any moderately sized property that might be able to sustain a hunter. This is a website, a nonprofit that links those two, the property owner and a responsible hunter. Again, if you have questions about this process, just feel free to reach out to us. So we have some materials available for people that are interested looking into this. This is a landowner agreement card. This something to this effect would be required if a hunter was going to hunt like close to a building. They would need written permission for that. And then this is information we discussed last time. Jody has this remarkably memorized. um, but this is an important act when it comes to letting people hunt on your property. So our community-based deer management program, Jody and I kind of share responsibilities for this. Um, Community-based deer management, by definition, is really means any management techniques that fall outside what is currently legal. So we're talking things like hunting at night, fertility control, alternate weapons like rifles, not slug shotguns, things of that nature. All of these things would require a special permit from us. It's a pretty lengthy application. Makes sense. We would need a lot of information to review to know whether or not to approve these activities, and it's ultimately approved by the New Jersey Fish and Game Council, um, a body of volunteers who are experts in various fields that ultimately would make the decision on whether or not one of these would get approved. Um, Again, can't stress this enough. For these programs to work, for a community to be able to resolve its deer population overabundance issue, um, cooperation with landowners is essential. And any of deer management programs require sustained effort. So deer, I saw somebody who attended one of my presentations up in Bergen County. He put in the chat last time this quote from my presentation. Deer reproduce at about 30% annually. That's a tremendous growth rate. So that's what they're capable of. And so under healthy conditions, yada yada. Suffice it to say, you need to aim for about a 30% reduction each year to basically see a slight reduction or hit kind of even. So a sustained effort is just implicit in deer management. It's not a one and done solution unless you're like a very small property that removes deer and then puts up a fence. You don't have to think about that 30% rate, but if you're a township, you do have to think about that rate. So this is an example of one of our community-based permits. So I would focus on blue being the number of deer found dead on the roadway. And then that green line, which is the cull totals for those years. And basically, you can see that after the onset of this culling program in Princeton in the early 2000s, that their required cull numbers declined as they reduced large portions of the population, as did the number of dead deer found on the roadway. Though you can see how sustained it is. Each year they harvest this private company, the contractors that do the sharpshooting and lethal removal. They harvest about 125 deer in Princeton each year, and that's on top of regulated sportsmen hunting on some properties in the township. So it's a lot of deer and requires a sustained effort. And last slide, believe it or not. This is a recent example that we had. We had a meeting with this town, Bloomingdale and Passaic County, last week, and I thought it was a simple enough example to be worthwhile sharing that, a real ending thought in this conversation was that they were really asking us about the town itself, the downtown area to the south on the map, where it's more densely populated with roads and smaller properties. But currently, to the west, that's a large private property owned by a corporation. To the north, that's a lakeside community, kind of a homeowners association situation. And to the east, that's a quarry with some small chunks of municipal properties interspersed. But for this town to meet their management goals, they need to get cooperation from each of these entities in a pretty significant degree. Also from the state parks to the north, which did have a recent closure of that area. So, for this audience, these backyard stewards, I think it's really important to consider the impact that not managing the deer, it's not just limited to your property. deer roam and they're browsing throughout their home range. And so these impacts trickle over, and these deer breed and help fuel increased populations in surrounding areas. So hunter access is extremely important. So until the town has meetings with these large private property owners and gets on the same page with them and creates an amiable plan between those groups, it's really difficult to imagine that the community will see the relief that they're looking for. So, with that, that's what I had on the slide deck. My email's on the bottom, and then our general deer email is there on the bottom as well, New Jersey Deer at dp.nj.gov. And please feel free to reach out.
Cool. Man, Brian, thank you. I don't know if I'm gonna clap. You did a great job, man. That
Thank you.
was
Appreciate it.
fantastic. Just a ton of information. I was taking notes as you talked, and I've got a couple pages here. That was really, really interesting stuff. Thank you. So let's just jump into questions quick. It looks like there's some people looking for some clarification first. So one was a question about black bears. Um, their predation, I guess, on deer, on fawns in particular. It sounds like maybe that was left out. Is that something that affects the deer population some?
Yeah. So yeah, it's hard to go into detail on every little thing, so I apologize for that. Black bears, as the sounds like the question asker stated, that's overwhelmingly they're predating on them when they're fawns. So they're just using their nose to seek out fawns that are immobile or close to immobile. They will feed on sick deer at times, but generally speaking, a deer is going to be very good at evading. A healthy adult deer is going to be extremely good at evading a black bear. Likewise, a bobcat, and likewise, generally speaking, coyotes. So black bear, we factor in their mortality mostly at that fawn phase, and I think worth mentioning that studies have shown that between bear, bobcats, and coyotes, some studies have shown up to 90% fawn mortality in areas. Actually, there's some examples of 100% of the fawns that these scientists located, put collars on, or whatnot to keep track of them. 100% of them died. So in certain areas under certain conditions, these can actually really significantly limit a deer population. But bears in particular, I think are more minor generally on a deer population than coyotes. Coyotes are definitely hitting fawns harder.
Brian, somebody asked about diseases, and you mentioned that population decreased just a couple of years ago. What's kind of the current state, I guess, with diseases and such? And maybe is it specific to portions of the state, et cetera?
Yeah. So and Jody, I might tap you in here for the specific example of South Jersey, but to broadly start out, um, we saw between those 2 years of epizootic hemorrhagic disease, those two major outbreaks that we had, I believe it was 2021 and 2022, we saw the highest declines, generally speaking, in the western portion of the state and then in the southern portion of the state. So in the southern portion of the state, um, generally the population is less fecund down there. The habitat is not as good for the deer. Um, Areas that are very close to larger farms, they might be doing a little bit better because it increases their fecundity, it increases their birth rate to just be bigger, healthier because they're eating a lot of high nutrient dense food that agriculture provides. But generally speaking, they fared worse in those areas. We haven't had an EHD outbreak, a significant EHD outbreak. It occurs very spotty, very small, insignificant on a population scale. It occurs every year. But those big outbreaks we haven't had since 2022. And as that graph showed, our population has been on the increase since then. But Jody, do you want to give a little update for those couple zones down there?
Yeah, so Brian's right. So it's EHD. It's spread by an insect. It's not transmissible from deer to deer. And these biting midges typically are found in southeastern United States, and they can get like pushed up when storms come through in the fall, like summer and fall. But yeah, we did have an outbreak, a back-to-back outbreak in a couple of the southern zones that really impacted the herd. It dropped it significantly. When we get these outbreaks, are not necessarily the same statewide. They're very localized. These midges travel through water corridors. So you can have very, very localized significant impacts, which is what we saw in two zones down south. We saw it in a couple zones, but specifically two zones down south, where the herd was just not rebounding. So we had to shut a couple of the seasons down for the past 2 years. We've been monitoring those populations, and we're going to do some spotlight counts again this early spring and see where it is to determine if we're going to open up those zones or not. But other than that, deer get sick just like humans do. They can get viral loads, they can get bacterial loads, depending on the condition of each individual deer. We do get some cases of pneumonia here and there. We do not have chronic wasting disease. That's the big one that everyone's always concerned about. It's in Pennsylvania and it's in New York. It's in Maryland. So, we're doing everything that we can to try to not have it come to New Jersey. It's 100% fatal. It's similar to mad cow disease or scabies in sheep. So those are the big ones for deer. As far as diseases, you may see some, mange. You might see some, other growths that they're called fibroids. But that's about it as far as diseases.
Okay. Just a clarification. You said 30% increase the population. That's kind of the typical increase year over year.
So that is their potential growth rate. So that would be if you factor in immigration and birth rates against kind of that bucket. I'll try to jump to it.
Yeah.
That against the death rate and immigration rate. So a lot of communities in New Jersey are at a homeostasis or at like kind of a balance in their deer population between the birthing and immigration and death rate and immigration, i.e., they're not seeing the population increase more. And the balance is due to habitat degradation, or the deer, their fecundity is going down because they're less fit. Each doe is able to have less fawns each year and successfully raise them. And they're getting hit by cars at a pretty dramatic rate. And those two factors together are balancing the deer population. So we would describe that as an unhealthy balance, even though it is in homeostasis.
There's a question on here. Actually, gentleman I know who owns property has a forestry plan. His question was related to, I guess, depredation permits. Farmers get those, but the question is, can a forested landowner with a forestry plan not have the same opportunity?
Jody, can I pass it off?
Yep, sure. So depredation permits are legislative. So it's a statute, it's a law that we can only issue depredation permits to farmers with standing crops. So this has come up, time and time again. So the Department of Ag, through lobbying from the Farm Bureau, they were able to change their definition of what agriculture is statutorily. So they were able to get a law change that says, as far as ag legislation, that would also cover foresters. It covers sugar maple industry, maple syrup, and then also some like stewardship and logging, that kind of stuff. So even though that definition includes that for the Department of Ag statutes, for the depredation statute, it doesn't include that. So, we've been asking the Farm Bureau, if there's other entities, nonprofits, the New Jersey Outdoor Alliance, they can lobby to get those laws changed. We as an agency can't do that. So, if you guys want to try to push that through, that's something that I think it came up at the last meeting. That's something that we could use help to try to get some of that stuff changed. Because, we have a lot of open space, either, municipally owned, state owned, privately owned, and you're trying to do all of these good things to bring it back, to a natural, native species. And then you're getting hit with the deer that are causing the damage. So that's why it's not that we don't want to issue the permits. It's just that legally we're not allowed to. It has to be standing crop only.
Got it. Okay. A couple questions relative to kind of deer counts, I guess, population surveys and such. You kind of talked about this, Brian, but one was, can you speak to the drone operations for determining a community's deer populations? Maybe just kind of a quick, how do they do that kind of question?
Sure. Yeah, it's something we're undergoing now. Our agency just acquired a couple new drones that comply with some issues with Chinese software. So we're working towards doing it ourselves. But again, Dr. Jay Kelly, he's really the expert on deer drone surveys in New Jersey. Um, and basically, what they do under this methodology is that they fly a quadcopter or a four propeller drone, and they fly it in transects over a municipality or a study area. And as they locate groups of deer through thermal imagery, they lower down, they count the deer, identify them as deer, not like a coyote or a goat, something like that. They note down the direction of travel of those deer so they avoid double counting it, and they continue on their transect. And so, with drone surveys, you actually can theoretically count every single individual in an area, particularly in smaller areas. On bigger areas, there's more complicated types of studies that are conducted with like fixed wing drones where they're missing a lot of deer, but you have an estimate of how many deer you miss. Um, and similarly, our spotlight surveys that we've been doing for many years at Fish and Wildlife, we have essentially an idea of the general range that we're detecting deer at, and we can make an estimate on how many deer we're missing in that range, and then we extrapolate over the area that we know we did not survey, and we get an estimate that way. So hopefully that answers that question decently.
Yeah, that's a good one. Let's see. Um, let's see. I've got a question. Could you just briefly explain? This is probably kind of elementary for a lot of people, but what, why are we encouraging people to harvest does as opposed to bucks when we're trying to reduce deer populations?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I did gloss over it. So, um, deer populations are essentially almost entirely relegated by the doe population because a single male deer will breed with many female deer, but the female deer, they need to be bred, each of them, to have offspring, and um, they their birth rate is probably what's most significant towards the population growth rate, if that makes sense. So a healthy doe will have more offspring. And so we have regulations in the state, like in September, in our more liberal zones where we're trying to reduce the deer population, we instituted what's called an earn a buck season, where in order to even be allowed to harvest a buck, um, a hunter must first, during that period, harvest an antlerless deer. Um, and that has been the single most effective management tool, other than increasing season dates, um, to reduce the deer population through recreational hunting. Again, these are with this kind of statewide view, people operating underneath the recreational season and not in like a specific management program. Um, we're dealing with a lot of different types of people. And so that's why we institute a rule like that, because, a sustenance hunter that is basically interested in harvesting any deer, we don't have to coerce them into harvesting a doe. But for certain hunters, they're most interested in a buck because it comes with a lot of things that are special and important about deer. I showed mostly pictures of bucks in this presentation for a reason. They're gorgeous. But anyways, those hunters during those seasons, we try to encourage them to harvest the does.
Got it. Um, so on that, just this is just my own curiosity. I remember that population graph you had up. It looked like there's been a pretty significant uptick in the population over the last couple of years. Any
Ye-
particular any particular reasons why, or kind of a hypothesis as to why it's been, I mean, it's pretty significant, right, in the last couple of years. It's up there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I would I would again stress that these are pretty cursory estimates, and I actually I'm pretty suspicious about 2024, to be honest. I think the direction of growth is accurate. I'm not sure about the magnitude of growth for
Okay.
that. That being said, um, we see this time and time again that the our in the hunted population, which is what this estimates, that our deer hunting regulations are actually very effective at managing the deer population. Um, so we see this relative stability, particularly since the late 1990s, with a gradual decline for a reason is because we increased season dates, um, and we opened up different weapon types, added earn a buck, and so we had a calculated decline in the statewide deer population again in certain zones where we had that goal. Um, then I am honestly slightly suspicious again about the 2017 to 2020 increase there. Um, Ultimately, the model that we use currently is extremely reliant on the ratio of 1.5-year-old bucks to the rest of the bucks that we aged, and we age only about 1,000 deer each year, which is pretty significant. That's usually about 5% of our deer harvest that we age, and we can populate into this model. But that still has locational biases because we only have certain butchers that we receive these deer to age from and things of that nature. So, to put it simply, we broadly trust the direction that the estimate is saying. And what it's saying in these recent years is that there was a significant decline in because of epizootic hemorrhagic disease, and that disease has ceased to impact the population. And so there's a steady rebalance back into that kind of homeostasis that we've been seeing for the last number of years. Again, I don't think it's that dramatic.
Okay. Okay, let's see if we got a couple more here. We got about 5 more minutes left if we want to go to 8:30. Um, like so Jay Kelly's map there kind of had some, hot spots where they were doing the surveying. It was showing, you know, let's look at it one more time here.
I think
So
I
you
have it up
have,
here.
so if you look way up in the north, that's a green circle. So you're 20 to 40 deer per square mile way up in the north. And then as you kind of come down, you're still 20, 40. And then really it's orange, red is kind of the hot spots. And then that maroon. Okay. So like if
Hmm.
you had to describe, I guess, community wise, like you talked about Central Jersey, like you had the Princeton information, like what's kind of like, what are the areas, I guess, name a few towns where you're like, this is where we see significant deer populations on average. What are those communities, I guess?
Okay, that's a good question. Again, this is um, it is variable, and people's experiences are going to be very different based on where they specifically live in a given town. So if I call out your town, it's not an attack on you specifically, and if it doesn't agree with your view of the situation, there could be a good reason for that. Um, like if you're a hunter, you are in an area that you can hunt. And so in that local area, the deer population is being managed to some degree. And you might think that, somebody's saying that they need to reduce the deer population in your neck of the woods you might think that's a bad idea because you think that there's a moderate deer population, not a high deer population. That might be true. Anyways, with that big disclaimer in mind, um, all of Bergen County, where there's any green on the map in Bergen County, there is essentially no management. In the whole county, we have about 100 deer harvested a year. So there, people are replanting. It's a fairly affluent county. They're replanting their hostas or replanting their gardens. These deer are doing the best in these backyards and little municipal parks. Um, I would say Warren County, Hunterdon County, those estimates probably make sense. This is less so because we have pretty good hunter access in these areas, other than more of the like urban centers. Think of like places like Flemington. Um, Other than those areas, we have pretty good hunter access, generally speaking. But we also have agriculture that increases the birth rate of these deer, and so that homeostasis is a little different. That being said, too, though, where you have agriculture subsidizing these deer populations, that is a significant portion of their diet that is not in the woods. So it is reasonable to say that in a more in a mosaic with agriculture that the issues with deer overbrowsing in our natural spaces might not be as big of a deal at X density compared to X density like up in the Adirondacks where they're just feeding in the woods. Um, so you know, a lot of Monmouth County, if it's not a county park, it tends to be underhunted. If you've ever been to Sandy Hook, that is a great place to get pictures of deer. They put salt blocks out, the staff there. They're probably feeding them as well. Um, um, Jody, I mean, feel free to chime in. I mean, most of these shore communities, like Lakewood, Brick, a lot of these kind of along the east. I can bring up that map again. This fella, let me see. Um, a lot of these areas where we have it's more blue. Um, those tend to be places where it's just hunter access issues. The dark blue specifically, the light blue, like in the Pine Barrens, there just is lower deer populations and there's high hunter access, so things are pretty well balanced. Somerset County has a lot of deer issues. Essex County, Hudson County. Jersey is the highest densely populated state, and so hunter access is going to be very limited in a state like that. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's good. I'm looking back in the Q&A. I think we got most of them talking about reducing buck tags. We kind of covered some of that. This is kind of the last question here talking about venison being sold if it's processed in a USDA facility. So that's probably a little bit of a controversial topic, I'm guessing. But is there anything you would say to answer that question real quick?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take a stab, and then Jody, if you want to fill in the blanks,
Yep.
feel free. Yeah, I mean that is immensely controversial with this subject. So I kind of breezed through it, but we'll take a gander. Um, when you bring up to a wildlife biologist the idea of market hunting being reintroduced, it does come with these memories of not that long ago where it was very out of control. Obviously, today, when somebody's bringing back market hunting to ungulate populations that are perceived as or are overabundant. They are talking about regulated market hunting. I don't think anyone's suggesting unregulated market hunting. A couple issues that arise with regulated market hunting in today's economy is one that these white-tailed deer back in the day, the drive for those was not the meat, it was the hide. The hides were being shipped back to England, European countries, and they were being used for the leather to make belts in factories during the Industrial Revolution. But then once rubber plantations became extremely efficient, that supplanted any need for buck hides became inferior. They were harder to create versus those rubber parts for those factories. So it would just be the meat today, at least theoretically. I can't think of a hide market or any other market other than the meat. The meat of white-tailed deer is very lean. And while I enjoy it, hunters obviously enjoy it because they're going out of their way to get it. Um, but not everybody loves it, just to put it plainly. And if you're going to go to a restaurant and spend money on it, a lot of times they're going to go for that like fatty piece of meat that they're not cooking at home. So, there's really not a big market for it. There are places in North America that do have programs with market hunting, where like restaurants can pay hunters to go get deer. There's a program like that in Quebec. But it's just not having a population level impact, not a significant one, because that market has not been demonstrated to be there. That could change. I think the more people learn about how sustainably harvested these animals are, how healthy they are to eat, maybe the average Joe Blow going to X restaurant might be more interested in ordering venison. We just don't see that right now. I think there's potential for programs where maybe the government like Massachusetts has a somewhat similar program, not to the extent that they pay people to kill the deer, but the government itself in Massachusetts is paying butchers to butcher the deer to be donated to those in need. And that there is a very high demand for venison to those in need. What we're hearing from partners over at Hunters Helping the Hungry, Joe Basralian with New Jersey Conservation Foundation, sounds like they almost fight over the venison that the food banks are getting from Hunters Helping the Hungry and similar programs. And those kitchens want that meat. So there might be something like that in the future, but generally speaking, it's an issue with a market for it. Jody, do you have anything to add with that?
Yeah, you pretty much covered it. We haven't found that there's exactly what you said. There's not really a market or a demand for it on the commercial side. There's definitely a demand and a need and an outlet through the donation side
Mm.
to, have it go to food banks. It's a high protein, high quality meal. That seems to be the better outlet. If we can just find, consistent funding for that, that would be probably the way to go, other than just selling it at the grocery store.
Got it. Okay, I think we ought to land the plane here. It's after 8:30. So, any closing thoughts, Brian, Jody, if you had to just leave us with one or two things?
You want to go, Brian?
Sure. I mean, I said it towards the end. If you're on the fence about having hunters on your property, it's a really important local sustainable food source for people. People really value that access. And if you're on the fence, you want to learn more, reach out to us. There's a chance we might be able to point you in the right direction towards finding a hunter. I would encourage people to start using that. I'll put it up so that it's on people's mind and in their face. The sharing the land.
Yeah.
Let me back this up. Start using it. If nobody uses it, it's not going to work. But if people start using it, it might work. So check it out. And 78% of New Jersey is privately owned. So that's 78% of deer management or close to it needs to occur on those properties.
Before Jody goes, Brian, would you kick it to the last slide so people have your email just in case they want it? Because we did have a few questions. Like somebody asked if you could share
Sorry.
that card, I think, and then maybe the landowner the liability thing.
Those are
So,
found in the digest as well.
okay,
The
got it.
Landowner Liability Act, you can just Google that. The hunter access cards you can find in our digest.
Got it. Okay, cool. But yeah, his email's down at the bottom there, so grab that if you want. Or it sounds like that New Jersey Deer at DEP will get to you all too at some point, I
Yes.
guess. Okay.
That goes to everybody. Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Jody.
Yeah, and yeah, I'll just add again, when we were here last time, I just want to thank you for having us because we deal with hunters all the time. Obviously, we deal with farmers a lot. We deal with counties, municipalities, but the private landowner is a area that we haven't had a lot of chance to interact with. So this was great. The last time was great. This was great. Brian did a really good job. So we just want to thank you again because it's getting the message out to a group that we don't normally have a chance to interact with. So we appreciate it and definitely reach out to us. Anything we can do to help, we're here.
Great. Awesome. Thank you on behalf of the Forestry Association, Brian and Jody. Thank you so much for coming. And to everybody who tuned in, thanks for taking an hour and a half on a Thursday night to listen in. This will be recorded like it always is. It'll pop up on YouTube in a week or so on our YouTube page. So check that out. You can forward it along to anybody who may have missed it. And we'll see you next month at the next Backyard Forestry. All righty. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Good night,
Have a good
everybody.
night. Happy New Year.